Good afternoon. Is that on, Brian? Is not on? Is on? Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program. I'm Alexis Applegate with the two Mississippi Museums. We're glad to have you in our home, the Craig H. Neilsen Auditorium, in the Mississippi Museum of History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. I want to also welcome everyone joining us on Facebook and YouTube. If you're watching online, remember that our programs remain available to view at any time. At this time, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. Before we begin today's program, we'd like to invite you to join us on Tuesday, September 1st from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. as we celebrate Hezekiah Watkins' birthday at the two Mississippi Museums. We will share this experience. Mr. Watkins will share his experiences as a freedom rider at 11 a.m. in the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum in Gallery 3. Copies of his book, Pushing Forward, the story of Mississippi's youngest freedom rider, and t-shirts will be available for purchase, followed by a book signing. We hope you'll join us. Today, we are delighted to welcome Jasmine Holmes, Director of Museum Education at the two Mississippi Museums. Jasmine is a historian, educator, and author whose work is rooted in exploring the stories and experiences that help us better understand Mississippi's past. She is an author of several works, including Carved in Ebony, Crowned with Glory, and Come Yonder Day. Her newest work, USA Today best-selling Our Sister's Keeper, marks her debut in fiction. Jasmine has a particular interest in the WPA narratives and photographs held here at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. These firsthand accounts offer an extraordinary glimpse into the lives of formerly enslaved Mississippians, preserving details about their families, occupations, communities, and personal experiences. Today, Jasmine will share her research and some of the lessons she has drawn on from reading these narratives, helping us consider not only what these documents tell us about the past, but also how we can thoughtfully engage with the stories today. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to my friend, Jasmine Holmes. What do I click? I'll do that. Good afternoon. Like Alexis said, my name is Jasmine, and I am really excited to be talking to you today about the WPA ex-slave narratives. So I come from the classroom, and so I'm a big call and response person whenever I am teaching or talking. So I would love to know if any of you guys have heard about the WPA ex-slave narratives before. You can see it, raise of hands. Okay, who has read them before? Who's read like 10 of them before? Okay, 20, 30, 40. Oh, okay, I love this. So there are about 3,000 narratives, and I have read most of them. I don't like to say all because there could be some that I maybe missed. But when I came to the narratives originally, I came to them with a little bit of suspicion that you may have also heard about the narratives. They were collected in 1936. They were collected by white interviewers from Black folks in the Jim Crow South. They are kind of unreliable when it comes to dates. Sometimes there are there's a lot of praise towards enslavers in the narratives. And so because of that, a lot of people don't read the narratives or kind of put them aside as something that is unreliable, something that we should not be looking at to gain historical insight. And I think that that's a mistake. So basically that's what this conversation is going to be about, how to read. Can y'all hear me? Louder? Okay. Closer? Okay. How about that? Is that good? Okay. Okay. How to read the narratives, even though we kind of approach them with the knowledge of ways that they might be a little bit fraught with complication. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what we'll be talking about today.
So a little bit about the narratives. Like I said, there are about 3,000 narratives. They were collected in 1936, and they were collected from 17 different states. Now, there are large regions of these states where narratives were not taken, so they're not a good subset of every area of enslavement, but they give us a nice wide variety of insight from different states and different experiences of enslavement. One of the most interesting things about the narratives for my research is that 50% of them are reported by women, right? And so when we talk about traditional slave narratives, we think about like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, very few of those narratives are written by women and give kind of a woman's perspective on enslavement. So what's cool about that WPA ex-slave narratives is that 50% of respondents that we're gonna be hearing from are women, and they're gonna be talking about their specific experience with enslavement. So Mississippi has an interesting story because in 1936, when it sent in its interviews for the WPA, first of all, let me start with, in 1936, the Works Progress Administration had an arm called the Federal Writers Project, which created white-collar jobs for people during the Great Depression. Mostly white people were interviewers for the WPA narratives, but there were some Black interviewers as well. In Mississippi, there were only white interviewers, and in Mississippi, only 26 narratives got sent in to the Library of Congress. So from 1936 into the 70s, Mississippi was known for those 26 narratives, which are largely very complimentary of enslavement, nostalgic about enslavement. And so in the 1970s, a man named George Rawick had set about collecting the narratives and making them widely available in a series of books called An American Slave. And our very own Jane Hilligus and a man named Kim Lawrence actually located 500 unsent narratives right here in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. And so Mississippi went from being one of the least reported states with narratives, having only 26 to having 526. And those 526 give us a really interesting insight because some of the 500 that didn't get sent in are previous versions of ones that ended up in the Library of Congress. So you can see how they were edited and how they were changed before they got sent in, which makes the Mississippi narratives especially interesting. So this talk is divided into a few different segments. And in this segment, I want to talk about how we approach the archive when it comes to Black history in general, and what we lose if we lose the WPA narratives as a source of information. So behind me is a picture of a deed. A certain Negro woman named Jane, together with 4 children, Sanders, a boy, Laura, a girl, Minerva, a girl, and Evelyn, a girl, are being deeded by a man named Thomas Neilsen. He is signing this deed, and he is deeding this woman and her children to his white daughter. This is the first document that I have of a member of my family here in the United States, a Black member of my family here in the United States. So Jane lived in Mississippi with her children, and she ended up being given to her enslaver's daughter. Jane is my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, and Thomas Neilsen, the man who signed this deed, is my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. This is how we normally learn about the lives of the formerly enslaved. We learn about them through documents of their oppression, right? We learn about them through deeds, through slave schedules, through the journals of their enslavers. We learn about them through the eyes of kind of the oppression that really identified their experience here in the United States. And so I don't have any other narrative of Jane. I don't have any diaries. I don't have any interviews that were taken from her. All that I have of Jane is this deed. And this is my only way to kind of see and access her and her history. So Sadia Hartman talks about this. She says, the archive is, in this case, a death sentence, a tomb, a display of the violated body, an inventory of property, and asterisks in the grand narrative of history. This is from her really popular chapter, Venus in Two Acts. And what Hartman is kind of getting at here is the crux of why I think the WPA narratives are so important. We so rarely get to find out about the history of Black Americans from Black Americans, everyday Black Americans, once we get back to enslavement. We only find out about their history through things like that deed through things like those slave schedules. And so the WPA narratives give us a really unique opportunity to hear people talk about their own experiences. When we think about history in the United States, we think about literacy, we think about reading, we think about primary sources that are passed down through the written word. Unfortunately, one of the reasons why we have so little record from the mouths of Black Mississippians about their experiences in enslavement is because of the legislated illiteracy that was the norm both here and in other slave states in the South. And so you have this group of people who have a vibrant history and have stories to tell, but then you have a discipline of history in the United States that is identified with literacy. And so you make literacy the bar to take part in this historical analysis, and the bar is here, and then you have a whole group of people who cannot make the bar because they cannot participate in that literacy that kind of makes the history that we talk about every day. So one thing that I tell everyone when we talk about the WPA narratives, and one reason I was so excited to see so many hands stay raised, is that you don't really learn from the narratives by reading one narrative or 5 or 10. You learn about the narratives by reading 20 or 30 or 40. And through reading several narratives, things start to kind of rise to the top. And this is an example of that. So there are a couple of different phrases in narratives in Arkansas, in Mississippi, in Texas, that echo over and over and over again. So I have a few of them here. One of them is from William Johnson, a slave narrative written in 1846, and these other two are from the WPA ex-slave narratives. And so there's two phrases that I, in my thesis, kind of tracked through the WPA narratives. One was in his pocket, and one was drank her up. And so the first one, in his pocket, there are several different narratives that talk about my enslaver would put me in his pocket, or he would put my mother in his pocket, or he would threaten to put us all in his pocket. And that phrase means that the enslaver would sell the person and then pocket the money and then put the money in their pocket. There's another phrase throughout the WP narratives, he drank me up, or he drank my mother up. That, of course, is enslaver sells his family off for, or sells an enslaved family off for, to pay off a whiskey debt. And so phrases like this are really interesting because they really show the deep commodification of the enslaved, particularly here in Mississippi. This phrase shows up more than anywhere else that I have seen it. But it really shows kind of the heart of this issue, because commodities can't really tell their history, right? Cotton is a commodity, and people tell cotton's history. Cotton doesn't tell cotton's own history. When we kind of set that bar of primary sources so high that things like the WPA narratives don't become part of what we are taking into account when we try to reshape and reformulate the experiences of the past, then we kind of participate in this commodification by agreeing, okay, these people were not allowed to read, were not allowed to write their history. Now at their old age, in their 80s and 90s, they're being interviewed by the WPA. And it's really easy for us to see kind of the gaps in their testimony. But it's also really easy to see the kind of echoes throughout their testimony. And so you see these beautiful things that kind of come to the surface. They're echoed over and over again about motherhood, about fatherhood, about the culture of going down to the holler to worship, about, you know, turning pots over so that enslavers wouldn't hear their songs. Like, all of these beautiful details are kind of buried into these separate narratives. And the more narratives you read, the more these details start to echo each other, and the more you can kind of see the story being laid out. Does that make sense? So Alexis Wells Agogame, she wrote a book called The Souls of Womenfolk, where she talks about the history of womanhood and enslavement using the WPA narratives. And she said, people collect knowledge and histories over time via experience and comparisons to similar accounts. She talks about the narratives and things like them as threads that we're collecting to tell a bigger story. So again, the story here doesn't come from just reading one narrative. It comes from looking at the body of work and kind of charting those similarities throughout the body of work that tell us a lot about enslaved experience. So we talked a little bit about how the narratives were met with a lot of suspicion by some people who did not want to tell the history of enslavement in the first place, but also by people like John Blassingame, who is a renowned historian of Black enslaved life. And even he kind of has some suspicion about the WPA ex-slave narratives, again, because they are interviews taken in 1936. They're interviews taken largely by white women in the Jim Crow South. And they are interviews taken from people who in 1936 are quite old, but were very young when they experienced enslavement. And so all of those things kind of have caused a lot of historians over the years to look at the WPA narratives with a large measure of suspicion. So one of the really cool things about living in Mississippi and reading the Mississippi narratives is that you can actually read the edits yourself in the Mississippi narratives because of those 26 that got turned in, because of the 500 that we have in our archives. A lot of those 500, like I said, are previous versions of what ended up being sent to the Library of Congress. So an example here is, this is a whole paragraph that was cut out of the Library of Congress version in one of the Mississippi narratives. He says, "I recollect one time when there was snow on the ground and it was freezing cold in the middle of the night. We heard somebody knocking at the door. He said he was freezing to death. My mammy got up and did all she could to help him, but his feet was froze and 2 of his toes dropped off when they thawed." This entire paragraph is just not in the narratives that got sent into the Library of Congress. And there's several examples of that in the 26 narratives that did get sent to the Library of Congress. So that kind of puts in perspective a lot of the other hangups that people have with the narratives. We see a lot of praise in the narratives for enslavement, how kind masters were, how rosy slavery was. 3 examples here. I won't read them. But a lot of that comes from a lot of different things. It's the Great Depression, it's 1936, people are starving. If you come to them and you talk to them about enslavement and they think about a time when they had 3 meals a day and now they don't, or you would come to them and you would ask them about enslavement and maybe you're a white person they know, so they're not going to talk to you about enslavement, or maybe you're a white person that knows they're enslaver, right? And so throughout the narratives, you start to see kind of this distancing language that still shows the truth. So one example would be in a narrative, you might have somebody ask a question like, "Was your enslaver kind to you?" And the respondent would be like, "Oh my goodness, so kind, so amazing. But there was this one next door and he was awful. And I heard all these stories about the one next door, not mine, but the one next door." Right? Or you would have somebody, you have narratives even in Arkansas where you can literally see a respondent being like, "Hey, stop talking to me. Stop telling me what to say. I'm going to say what I want to say." Or "Just be quiet. I want to answer your question." Right? So you can see kind of those interventions taking place in some of the narratives, but if you don't know where to look for them or to look for them, you might not see them. So another example of kind of going around this prejudice in the narratives is an interviewer named Samuel Shinkle Taylor. He was an interviewer in Arkansas. And Taylor was interesting because he was a Black pastor in Arkansas. So he had a lot of clout in the community. People knew him, right? People respected him. But also something interesting about Taylor was that he would go to these interviews with these older folks in Arkansas, and he would take his daughter with him. Taylor wouldn't have anything to write with. He would just be sitting there talking, locked in. His daughter would actually be behind him writing in shorthand what the interviewers said, right? And so when you read Shinkle's interviews, they're completely different from anything else that is in the repository that is the WPA ex-slave narratives. And so with Shinkle, you see what these interviews could have been with a more conscientious folklorist, but you also see the plain fact that in states and in instances where you had Black interviewers, you got a lot different responses to questions about enslavement or questions about the past. And so with Black interviewers, for instance, Tennessee had an entire Black unit. And those stories are some of the most devastating stories in the WPA narratives because there's no holding back in those stories, right? And so you take those things into account, right? You take into account who is interviewing this person, what stakes does this person have? In some of the interviews, you can even see some of the interviewers are giving money, right? They're being like, "Okay, I'll come back tomorrow and I'll bring you money for food," or "I'll come back tomorrow and I'll bring you some food." Or they'll come and they'll say, "I'm with the government." And the first question from the person being interviewed is, "Do you have relief money for me?" Right? So you're constantly seeing those 1930s realities at play in the narratives as well. So Cornelia Andrews from Smithfield is a good example of something else that we should be looking for in the narratives. We talked about looking for who's the interviewer, right? But also who's in the room. So for Cornelia Andrews, she was interviewed in North Carolina in 1936, and her interviewer asked her a question that a lot of interviewers asked, which was, were you ever severely beaten? And her answer was no, I never was. And had she been in the room by herself, that would be the end of the story. The record would have said Cornelia Andrews was never beaten, and then we take that and we would have run with it as, okay, this is reliable information. But Cornelia Andrews was not alone in the room. Her daughter was in the room with her. And so her daughter speaks up and she goes, why don't you show them the marks on your back and let that be the answer to the question? So because her daughter was there, she kind of speaks up and goes, it was actually really awful. Like, I was actually beat really badly. And here's some stories. Here's the story of how that happened. Cornelia is the perfect example of what having an advocate in the room, how having an advocate in the room changed this interview. But look at it. It's not just Cornelia. So Cornelia has to remember her story, and then she has to tell it to a person who she's not sure is trustworthy. And then that person writes it down. And then that person takes it to an editor who edits it and maybe takes out a paragraph here, a couple words there, and then we get it, right? And so when we're reading the narratives, we have to be aware of all those different layers that happen before it gets to us. The record of Cornelia Andrews in, I use ancestry.com. That's my my research hub to try to find these people. And so I found Cornelia Andrews in a slave schedule for her master. I think his last name was Vaden. But in the slave schedule, it just says female 10. Doesn't say her name. It just says female 10. Because of the WPA narratives, we know her name, and we actually know stories about her now, and we actually know where her daughter ended up going to college, and we actually know there's so much more information kind of buried behind just that quote unquote respectable archive that we think about. Does that make sense? To make sure I'm making sense. So 2 other examples of how we can use the WPA narratives as an archive. Again, as I said, my thesis work kind of charted language. So I was very interested in those 2 phrases in particular. Drank my mother up, put me in his pocket. Those were the 2 that I was looking for throughout all of the WPA narratives. But another thing that I found throughout all the WPA narratives was kind of this echoing of blood. Every narrative except for every state except for Kansas has imagery about blood running down or blood flowing. And Mississippi did not have those in the 26 that got sent in, but these are from the 500. And so these are 2 really similar accounts from a woman named Hannah Chapman and a woman named Vinnie Busby about how their fathers did not live with them. Or I'll go ahead and read Vinnie's. So she says, my pa was owned by Marse Bill Brown, who owned a plantation near Marse Easterling. When he would catch him, he would beat him so hard so he could tell which way, we could tell which way he went home by the blood. But pa, he would keep coming to see us and take the beatings. Hannah Chapman, very similar. My father was sold away from us when I was small. He would often slip back to us cottage at night. When his Marse missed him, he would beat him all the way home. Us could track him the next day by the bloodstains. Originally, those 2 narratives were interesting to me because that last phrase, right? Track him home by the bloodstains. Okay, we're looking for languages, we're looking for threads, we're looking for things that repeat. So I'm very interested in this. But the more I looked at these narratives, the more I saw other similarities. Like, they both had a master who they described as stern. His name was Easterling. They described their cabins being kind of laid out the same way. They describe, of course, this incident with their father the same way. Turns out these women are from the same place and were likely enslaved by the same man. Again, this is something that an archive could tell us, right? But we don't get this eyewitness account from the archive that we're used to looking at. So how do we use the narratives with all of the hangups that I have mentioned? So there's a couple of different ways. One way is to work outward from the narrative. So with Vina and Hannah, I had the narratives and I said, all right, let me look in here and try to find any detail that I can about their life, about their enslavement. So I took the name that they gave their enslaver, Easterling, found him in the slave schedules. His name was Colonel William K. Easterling. He owned 29 people, ages 4 to 40. None of them were named in the slave schedule, though. Tried to match the ages to the narratives. Bleh. Words be hard sometimes. Tried to match the ages to the narrative's stated birth year to find their line in the slave schedule. I used land records and deeds to place the neighbors that they named, and I followed both of them through freedom, through marriage, through census records. So what came back were 2 women, Vina Brown Bosley and Hannah Brown, married to Bob Chapman in 1873, both at Cato, Rankin County, under one enslaver. So all of that hunting, and I wish that William was here, because I spent so much time next door in the archive trying to hunt down these women, because I am not an archivist, I'm not a genealogist. And so I would go over there and I would be like, I think I found Vinny. And William would look at it and he'd be like, this is not Vinny. Like, just not the right place, not the right time. Okay, all right, I'll come back again. I think I really found her this time. He would look, I don't think so. That's looking really thin. So we had to work really hard to find these women from their narratives. So again, the narratives do not give us that demographic information that we're used to finding in the slave schedules, in the archive, but they do give us that personal layer of what it was like to live life in enslavement. So talk to you guys about Jan, and how she was part of uncovering the 500 narratives that were here. They were just here all along, but we just never had sent them in. And so I had the privilege of working in Jan's archive during grad school, and I was there to work on Freedom Summer stuff, which was great and like so interesting. And I got to work on Freedom Summer things from Holmes County, which is where my husband's from. And so fascinating, amazing, made a whole presentation about it, very into it. I was there for the narratives. And so I go and I'm doing the Freedom Summer thing, and I'm looking through boxes, and Jan has what I think honestly should be your pride and joy, Jan, it's this Rolodex. And it's all of the different narratives. So it's like all 500 narratives, and you would pull a name out of the bees, and it would be Vinnie Brown, and it would say her name, her age, where she was enslaved, who her enslaver was. And so Jan had gone through these narratives and has organized all of this biographical information. And that's just the first step into how we can be using these narratives to find more stories and to connect more stories and to connect more stories to the archive. So 5 questions that we should ask when we approach any narrative. The first one is, who is holding the pencil? Name the interviewer before you quote the narrator. The interviewer is almost always named. 2, whose dialect is that? Phonetic spelling is a transcription choice, not a voice. One reason people don't read the narratives is because they are written a lot of times phonetically, and it's really hard to follow them. But if I were to spell W-U-Z for you, how would you say that? And if I was going to say W-A-S for you, how'd you say that? Okay. And if I was going to spell C-O-M-E, and if I was going to spell K-U-M, that would be right. So a lot of times, the people who are writing down these words and writing down this dialect are not just writing down what they hear, they're writing an example of the minstrel speech of the day, right? So it's not just, okay, I want you to hear that this person has an accent. It is, this person kind of sounds more ignorant than this person probably needs to sound, because W-U-Z and W-A-Z is the same word, sounds the same, right? So looking at the dialect, looking at those phonetic choices tells us something about the interviewer and the interviewee. Number 3, where does the lost cause enter? Watch for the aside about the good old days. 4, what survived the edit anyway? Names, places, prices, kin, sayings, the details no one thought to remove. And then number 5, who else is in the room? A daughter, a neighbor, a grandchild. Often the reason the hardest thing gets said, like in Cornelia's example. 4 is interesting to me. What survived the edit anyway? Names, places, kin, sayings. When we look at the narratives and we decide, okay, so these white interviewers interviewed these Black formerly enslaved people during the Jim Crow South, and they did it in ways that were not always the most honest. So we're just going to throw them out and we're never going to look at them again. When we do that, I don't think we're giving enough credit to people who are being interviewed, because there are lots of different ways to tell the truth. You can tell it straightforward. You can also tell it a little bit of a sneaky way too, right? The example that I gave earlier of maybe it's not safe for me to say my enslaver was not kind. Maybe it's safer for me to say it was the neighbor, right? Or maybe it's not safe for me to say I didn't get enough food. But maybe it's safe for me to say, but it was really plain food, right? And sometimes I was still kind of hungry afterwards. And so you find those little places where people have hedged, and the places where, regardless of what the interviewer's motive is in pursuing that interview, they're still interviewing somebody who has free will to be able to tell them something back, right? And it may not be the full, unvarnished truth of the thing, but I still think that we learn a lot from looking at what they were able to get across, right? What they were able to say anyway. You have Vinny and Hannah both talking about brutality that happened to their fathers that originally for, math is hard, 40 years? For 40 years was never at the Library of Congress. We never heard those stories. But then in the 70s, all of a sudden we have all of these 500 narratives in Mississippi, 500 new perspectives that are largely unedited that we can look at and that we can learn from. But again, it doesn't just come from reading one narrative, it comes from reading several. All right, so again, I come from the classroom. So I'm going to spend the last 10 or so minutes talking about how we can use the narratives with students. The same 5 questions are questions that we start with students. This is a narrative from Elvira Bowles, and Elvira Bowles' narrative is actually not in the Mississippi narratives. It is in the Texas narratives, because Mississippi wasn't the only state that held back narratives. Texas held back quite a few as well. And so Elvira's is one that was in the original group of narratives that were sent in, but was heavily edited. And when we found Texas's narratives that they held back, we found an unedited version of Elvira's narrative. When I teach the narratives to students, this is kind of how I teach it. So we talk about the narratives, we talk about the WPA, we talk about all of the issues, right? And then we kind of take this apart and look at it as text, right? So I have my master's is in history, but my undergrad's in English, and I taught English for 10 years. And so when I'm looking at these, I'm looking at them as kind of literary texts. And so we have Elvira Bowles' story. She ended up in El Paso, Texas, but she was actually from Holmes County, which is what originally interested me in her. And in every step of the way of her narrative, you can see different aspects of slavery and different aspects of her life that are being revealed. So for instance, she talks about hard work, but God was with me. We'd work till dark and quit a while after sundown. Master was good to slaves and didn't believe in just lashing them. He'd not be brutal, but he'd kill him dead right on the spot. Overseer would get after him and whip him down. I was 17 maybe when I married to slavables, married on Saturday night. Just in this one paragraph, we get religious phrasing. We learn about Elvira's metric of good. Was he a good master? Yes, he doesn't kill us. This also shows how normalized the intense labor was. Throughout her story, you learn about nursing, you learn about refuging, Mississippi, people who were enslaved in Mississippi refuging to Texas as the Union got further and further down south. You learn a lot about her own abuse as a young woman at the hands of her enslaver, all kinds of things that we can, I'm trying to figure out how to go back. All kinds of things that we can look at and learn just from her narrative. And so if a student is handed this narrative, they are able to see slavery's effect on motherhood. They're able to see phrases like work like a man. They're able to see that how she points to her lack of agency, how she did not know her age when she came to Bowles, right? All of those things are things that we can pull out for our pull out for our students so that they're able to engage these narratives and kind of engage these stories of enslavement. One thing that I have noticed in teaching students history is that they connect to people more than they connect to concepts, right? And so I could talk to them about enslaved women and the commodification of enslaved bodies and the chattel principle, and like I could talk to them about that till I'm blue in the face. But if they have a person to connect that to, if they have Elvira Bowles and they have her story to connect that to, then they are able to really retain that information, right? It becomes real. There's skin and bones. It's not just a story of somebody that we've never seen before. It's like it's a story of a mother now, right? It's a story of somebody's sister, somebody's wife. One of my biggest things that I love to do is to give book recommendations. And so I want to tell you guys what else you can read if you want to learn more about the WPA narratives, because this just only scratches the surface. One thing that you will notice, and that I noticed a lot when I was first learning about the narratives, was that the trailblazers when it comes to using the WPA narratives, when it comes to kind of dissecting the WPA narratives, those trailblazers are Black women historians. They are Darlene Clark Hine, right? They are Favolia Glenf. They are Alexis Walton-Bogomil. Like there's an entire generation of Black women historians who made it their business to kind of take these narratives from obscurity and bring them into mainstream conversation about enslavement. Again, not as these perfect documents, but as documents that can really help us kind of further interpret the archive that we read. I'll give y'all a second if you want to take a picture of this. Also, if you are interested in George Warwick's volume and you work here, I have it in my office. So. All right, so when I originally did my thesis and wrote Yonder Come Day, which is my book about the WPA narratives, for Jane was the constant. It was kind of my constant thing in the back of my head, like this is for Jane. My journey to Mississippi. So whenever people ask me, they'll be like, "Oh, where are you from?" Because obviously not from here, because you can hear me talk. And I'll say, Texas, and they'll say, "Oh, how'd you get to Mississippi?" And I'll go, "A man." And my husband's always like, "Why do you say it like that?" I'm like, "It's way more fun than saying my husband. Like, it was a man." And they'll be like, "Are you still with the man?" "Yeah, we've been married 12 years. We have 3 kids. Like, we're good." When we were dating, he told me over and over again, like, "Oh yeah, we'll never live in Mississippi. I don't want to live in Mississippi. I'm not interested. I'm good. We can stay in Texas." We moved to Minneapolis. And eventually, we'd been married for 2 years, less, 18 months. And we ended up living not just in Mississippi, but in Holmes County. We ended up living on a dead-end street in Holmes County. And the dead-end street backed up to the woods, which backed up to the highway. And we had one car, and my husband drove it 45 minutes into Jackson every day. And I would just walk around the town and with my baby in a stroller, and everybody from town, they think it's hilarious. Now they'll see me, they'll be like, "Hey, streetwalker, what's up?" I'm like, "Ah, this is funny. I get it." Because that's what I would do, because I didn't have anything else to do. I just like walk around. And my love of Mississippi was forged in Holmes County. That's where I learned to love this place and where I learned to call it home. And I had been saying all along, like, "Oh, my husband brought me here. I'm here because it's my husband's home. Like, this is why." When I started doing ancestry research and I found Jane's story, it became so important to me. Jane is not from Mississippi either, but she lived in Mississippi and she died in Mississippi, and she had all of her kids in Mississippi. And I always would say, like, Mississippi is this whirling vortex and it's going to bring its people home. Like, people are always coming back to Mississippi. And I like to think that Jane brought me back. It took 5 generations, but eventually she brought me back home. So maybe it wasn't a man, maybe it was a woman who brought me to Mississippi. It is significant to me that I will never be able to read Jane's account of her own life. That is something that is difficult for me. It's not unique to me as a Black woman in the United States. Lots of people have that experience. But I do feel like every time I read a narrative from somebody who was alive at the same time, who had the same experiences that she had, I feel like I'm reclaiming part of her story. I feel like I'm learning just a little bit more. And that comes, I think, from having a more communal understanding of our history as Black women in the United States. You know, Elvira and Jane are two very different people enslaved in two very different places, but a lot of their experience probably overlapped a lot. And so in reading Elvira's story, I feel like I'm reclaiming part of Jane's story. And in reading these narratives and in kind of looking for those gaps between what was said and what was meant, what we can verify and what we can't. I think being agile and looking at those gaps is just another way to show respect and enthusiasm for this really important part of our history. So I really appreciate you guys listening to me talk about it.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. I'm going to walk around with the microphone if anybody has any questions. Coming.
Hey, Jasmine.
Hello, sir.
So you've dedicated much of your work to recovering the voices of Black women who have been marginalized in historical memory. And the Mississippi narratives feature many women who survived the brutal realities of the cotton economy in Mississippi. What specific types of unseen leadership, resistance, or community care did you find Mississippi women enacting that often gets left out of the broader male-centric discussions of slavery? You want me to repeat that last question?
No, that's such a good question. I promise I didn't give him that question, you guys. He came up with it all by himself. Let me see if I put it up here. I don't think I did. There's a book by Stephanie Camp, and I can see the cover of it in my head. I can't remember the title of it, but it talks about resistance from enslaved women in different ways than what we think about resistance. So when we talk about Mississippi, we don't have a Nat Turner or Denmark Vesey moment. Like, that's not Mississippi's form of resistance. My favorite form of resistance in the narratives comes from Elvira Bowles' narrative. And it comes from her saying how dog tired she was at the end of every day and how she would still stay up at night and quilt by candlelight. And to me, that act of creativity, that act of creating warmth, that act of doing labor that was for herself after a day of doing labor for her enslaver, is a form of resistance that we see over and over and over again throughout the narratives. Mothers who nurse their babies in spite of the fact that it was nearly impossible. I mean, like, I've nursed 3 children. When I think about being enslaved and working in the field and having to stop every 2 hours to nurse a child, or to let my child be nursed by somebody else, or to me, like, even the survival itself is the act of resistance, right? So 2 answers, maybe those pieces of creativity and those little pieces of survival. In the History Museum, which is my favorite museum. If you ever see me out here wandering around and you just want to go to the History Museum and you just want to talk about stuff, I will go with you. We could talk. But one of my favorite things in the museum is there's a display downstairs, and it has a cruisie and a dragging wheel in it. And those are both inventions by either informally enslaved people or brought over by an enslaved African. And one's a lamp and one's a pastry cutter. And even the act of bringing light to a place where there wasn't light before can, to me, be an act of resistance. Using a pastry cutter to make pastry beautiful can be an act of resistance. So, Closer to Freedom, that's the book by Stephanie Camp. It's very good.
Hi.
Hi.
So my question for you is, while you're doing this work especially during your thesis, while you were doing work in the archives and you're reading all these stories that are full of trauma, oppression, but also these little glimpses of light, how do you take care of yourself when seeing that type of violence over and over again?
I'm going to reference another book because I can't help it. Honoré Fanon Jeffers has a book, The Love Songs of W.E. Du Bois. And she talks about, in the book is about a young historian who she goes and she reads this story of the biggest slave sale in American history. And it's called The Weeping Time, is like the story of this sale. And it's a story of two people who loved each other very much being separated from each other. And in the book, the young person reads this story and she has terrible nightmares, and she wakes up the next morning and her mentor is like, "Oh, I told you, you got to pray. Like, you got to pray before you go to bed. You can't just take it with you." And that's, 100% my coping strategy of just prayerfulness, knowing when to step back. In this research, I had several days, weeks where I would just take a step back for a little bit. So yeah, being willing to do that, but then also like seeing those glimpses from people like Elvira and Hannah and Vina, those help keep me going. And like the search for their stories and the search for a story that's beyond the pain, I think is something that keeps me going.
Hello, hello, hello. Thank you so much for your presentation. Done very well. I appreciate the information. Alice, is it Alice Walker's Beloved? She's the author of the movie Beloved.
Oh, Toni Morrison.
Is it who?
Toni Morrison.
Toni Morrison.
Yes.
Thank you. We think that, oh, what a terrible thing to murder your children. That image itself would let you know how traumatic slavery, how traumatizing slavery was, and how traumatized we still are because we have not been counseled as a group of people. What are we going to do now?
That story is hard, and it's based on a true story too. When I was talking about nursing, I was thinking of a narrative, a specific narrative where the woman is talking about how she was like, my mom would just go and she wouldn't go back and nurse the baby. She would walk off the field and she would just sit in between the field and where the baby was and just pray the baby would die. And you think, oh, like that's cruel, or but that's how desperate the situation was. What I'm going to do now is I do go to therapy. To find it to be very, very important. And I also find that to be an act of resistance and care, looking back, to take care of myself. But also, I think there's a tendency to want to like move past the discomfort of a mother wanting to kill her children, of a mother not wanting to nurse her child, wanting her child to die, of a father not being able to come visit his children, or he will be beat so badly he will bleed all the way home. Like there's a tendency to want to move past that really quickly. And I think learning how to sit with it and learning how to keep that story alive is also really important memory work as well.
Hi. Was all the editing done on purpose? And why were those 500 narratives not turned in? Was this all like a big ploy? While you were speaking, I was thinking, so at the end of the WPA, after they finished the project, is it just kind of like, we're just going to just shut it down silently? Oh, well, please explain.
Yeah. So when I was researching the Mississippi narratives, I wanted so badly to learn about Pauline Dinkins. She was the main editor for the Mississippi narratives. And like, if I ever caught Pauline Dinkins outside, like I just want to talk. Because what do you mean? What do you mean 500 of them never made it in? I can't say what her motive was. I will say that Pauline Dinkins has two kind of two different places in our archive here at the Department of Archives and History. One of them is a fictional story that she wrote based on a narrative. And so when you read the story, you can see that her interest in the narratives was to collect folklore and to collect stories and to see them more as stories. And so when you think about the editing, I mean, I'm not going to say there wasn't any malicious intent, but I do think that a lot of editors like Pauline saw them as stories that needed to be told in a specific way. Like, oh, this narrative structure will work a lot better, and my worldview will get across a lot more if we just like don't say this part or we take out this part. Why we kept 500 narratives back, I don't know. But my thesis was almost about, because I'm from Texas. So Texas didn't keep back as many narratives, but it edited its narratives a lot more broadly, which I think is a really interesting study on the difference between white supremacy in Texas and in Mississippi. And I would love to like dive into that conversation with all of my spare time. I would love to research that.
Hi, I'm very happy to see that you acknowledge Jan Hilligas for the research. She's helped me enormously. But one of the things I've been pondering is there are some people who say that slaves were happy. And I'm wondering if it was due to this, for their not being direct in how their feelings.
Absolutely. And I would definitely say that I've seen some lost cause apologists use the WPA narratives to kind of prove that the enslaved are really happy, to take those pieces that we talked about and kind of say, see, they say they miss it. They say they want it back. And I think the fact that they've been used in that way is one of the reasons why a lot of us don't approach them anymore, because it's a lot of work to get past that. Yeah.
And remember that the narratives were taken in the midst of the Depression, so conditions were not good then.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add a couple of things to your list. George Rawik wrote a short volume called From Sundown to Sunup, The Making of the Black Community, which talks about when they weren't working for the master. And Ken Lawrence also wrote an introduction to the Mississippi narratives that's in the first volume of the 5 Mississippi volumes. So there are other details in those things.
And that's really good that Ken Lawrence, that essay was a huge eye opener for me. Yeah. This is Jan, by the way. You guys should give her a round of applause. Big part of why we have those other 500 narratives.
I was very interested in the 500 that were held back, but also you mentioned that other states kind of practice that, and the gentleman there asked about why. Did you find any themes, stories that stood out from the narratives that were held back that maybe gave you a clue as to why they were held back?
Yeah, those two, Vinny and Hannah, those two stories were two of the ones that were held back. They weren't in the original Mississippi ones that were sent in. And I remember, so they, the way that I read them was in the Rawik volumes. And so I open it up and it's like a 2,000-page volume. And I'm like, all right, well, let's go. And immediately you can see that there's a lot more violence. There's a lot more. But there's sometimes things that they cut out too that are like, maybe not as incriminating for enslavers, but just like the interviewers didn't think was interesting enough to make it into the narrative. So there's all kinds of, it's a really interesting study to read the ones that were withheld. Yeah. But that violent imagery in particular is what I was looking at when I was reading the ones that were held back.
I love this. We never get a chance to see as much that we want to see about ourselves. And this gives us a way, a lens to look through. So I taught speech at Jackson State for quite a few years. And one of the courses was just an introductory course, speech arts. And one of the assignments was an oral history interview. And I wanted my students to go back in their family. Now, of course, it's not going all the way back to slavery, but it's going as far back as they could go with maybe their grandparents or their great-grandparents. And I wanted them to do that because I thought that their kinspeople would be able to be as honest as possible because these were their children or their children's children. So when we looked at them, we looked at certain questions that we wanted to answer. And everybody had the same questions. The one question that they could not get that older parent, grandparent, great-grandparent to answer was white, black, male, female relationships. They tried to probe, they tried to, just, it's going to be just me and you. They did everything that they could, but those women did not want and would not answer that question. So I said to myself, even though these are their kin, they are embarrassed. They were devastated about what happened between them and the white men. And I had to draw some kind of conclusion from that. And it has something to do with sexuality and how they really felt about the trauma that they went through in that situation. And so, trying to now look at what we're going through now, so on and so forth, divorces and whatever it is, I just wonder what that trauma way back there, and then their information to their other children, female children, so on and so forth, what did that trauma do to us that we're still experiencing now? Because those great-grandparents would not answer that question.
Yeah.
They were too hurt.
Another book, but I think her name is Danielle McGuire. It's called At the Dark End of the Street. And is that it? And it's about the ways that the exploitation of Black women and their bodies kind of eventually contributes to a huge part of the civil rights movement. It's very interesting. But I did also notice that in narratives too, that it was very rare for women to talk about that kind of abuse. Even Elvira would, the way that she put it, you could tell that she had been abused in that way, but she put it in a very kind of roundabout sort of way. Yeah, those layers of shame. I mean, that's got to have an impact.
It's so important for all of us to hear this history and to be reminded of the truth and how to carry it forward. But in these days when we are seeing history being erased intentionally, it's especially important to hear the truth and the history. But how can we be subversive and keep that truth alive when people are trying to erase it intentionally?
I think keep passing the stories on. I mean, there's one of the reasons why I wanted to include this slide was to show that this is something that we can teach the next generation, right? Like these are ways that we can, and this is something that I use here in the museums for our camp. Like we're going to go over a Mississippi narrative just like this. I think coming to work here every day is a way to continue to speak the truth. But even if you don't have a job that's literally talking to people all day about history, passing it on to the next generation is, I think, the most important thing. I'm biased, I'm a teacher, but I do think that sometimes the most subversive thing that you can do is tell the truth. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. One last question from me. Where can we find your book, Come Yonder Day, or Yonder Come Day?
Oh yeah, Yonder Come Day is in the bookstore. So you can find signed copies in the bookstore.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Don't forget to join us next week for History is Lunch with Kelly Ellis to present Informed Imagination, Hard Research, and Poetic Narratives. Thank y'all. Let's give it up for Jasmine one more time. Y'all have a great day.